Hi, everyone. I'm Kathleen Oliveira, Solution Engineer at Anecdotes. Today, we're talking about one of the biggest shifts happening in GRC, the evolution from workflows to agents. So, to help us explore what that shift looks like in practice, I'm joined by Brittany Davis, Compliance Program Manager at 360 Insights Canada. Brittany has firsthand experience using AI and automation to scale GRC programs while keeping people at the center of decision making. In this conversation, we'll discuss where traditional workflows fall short, where agents can make the biggest impact, and what organizations need to get right before bringing agentic AI into their GRC programs. So, Brittany, let's start with your current GRC processes. Where do you see the greatest opportunity for automation in your current processes? Which manual tasks consume the most time today? And where could agents have the biggest impact in helping teams get compliance work done?
When it comes to workflows and agents, there is kind of the delineation and understanding that a workflow is do a thing, manual person steps in, do a thing, manual person steps in. And there's so much manual touch. I don't know about everyone else's GRC or security department, but I know that my responsibilities and what our org needs, especially given AI, that landscape and the horizon continues to expand. So things like workflows were nice maybe 5 or 6 years ago when we didn't have to consider the same level of risk, the same level of security operations or threat even when using stuff like that. So something like an agent being able to cut down on more manual tasks, such as kind of collecting information, making that easier for me, allows me to be more strategic in my approach to GRC because I don't have to spend the time constantly going through and approve next step to every part of the workflow. I can go in and see what my agent has collated for me, either in a dashboard or have it sent manually even to my email if I don't even want to sign into the tool, where I can kind of see what the tool has kind of put together for me. At that point, I can poke holes in it, right? So it's put it together for me in a way that I can now understand better what the landscape is rather than spending my whole morning approving Jira tickets with the correct workflow to then move to the next thing to ensure. I have agents that even review the Jira tickets now at this point for me to say what's missing or what our engineering teams might need to supplicate to ensure that our auditor doesn't have a problem. So things like that can then feed into the narratives that Anecdotes builds overall because it does connect to Atlassian. So it makes those types of things really easy, and I can easily write from the tool as well. So creating runbooks that can run automatically based on characteristics that I look for as a GRC professional in even the workflows that teams are using currently is how I can be much more of a bigger team, even though I might only be a team of a couple people.
That's a great perspective. I especially like your point that the goal isn't to remove people from the process, but to free them from repetitive work so they can focus on higher value decisions. That naturally brings us to another important question. For an agent to be genuinely useful in GRC, it also has to be reliable. What gives you confidence in an agent's output? And what context, data, and transparency does it need in order to support sound decisions?
Being able to understand why it came to the conclusion, not relying on the conclusion it made. So that kind of delineation between whether or not decision making is automated, which is usually a no-go in the space of GRC, right? You want an individual and a professional to be the one involved. But if I don't understand how an agent works or how it's thinking, getting to that regression conclusion through whatever tensor wave math layers it's using, then I'm not going to trust it because I don't know how it's kind of inferring what it's coming to that conclusion of. So again, data or it didn't happen in the structure. And of course, like data is messy. So being able to understand that the agent is relying on, consistent data before it gets to the stage of actually being used in that trustworthy space is really what's important.
I think that's such an important distinction. It's not about trusting the answer blindly. It's about understanding how the agent reached its recommendation. And that leads nicely into governance. When you hear the term agentic GRC, what comes to mind? What should organizations get right in their governance foundation before introducing agents into their environment?
I mean, when it comes to that, Kathleen, it's messy governance that makes it pretty evident, right? Like, I think most GRC professionals, and yes, this is broad brush speaking, run the other direction from AI agents because they know their asset inventory isn't complete, their controls aren't written well, their control implementation isn't done correctly. Is their risk register, when was the last time that was earnestly updated, right? So when it comes to messy governance, those problems exist regardless to whether or not you put an agent in your environment. And starting at that baseline to understand these agents don't create net new, they just pull in to help you develop what that net new is. So understanding that their job is to not make a decision for you or to infer or attempt to infer on things. Because if you just hook in an agent to any environment that you have, any vendor that you have or you're potentially using, and you don't take a look at what the initial stages of that trust layer that we talked about before, how it's built, what it's doing, it's just going to amplify all of those problems. So if you don't have good data classification, it's just going to show you very quickly and expeditiously that you do not have good data classification, and that's a larger problem than you might realize, which, sometimes can help target work that you might need to do in GRC or work that you might need to do as kind of the enterprise level to ensure your entire organization meets those things. But without considering that first layer of what your agent is building off of, it's just going to amplify that noise. So whether or not that's helping you collate the information or if it's making a bad problem worse, agents are very good at both.
I completely agree that agents can only amplify the foundation they're built on. If the underlying data and processes aren't in good shape, AI will simply magnify those problems. One last question. You've described agents as having two important roles: researching the context around potential issues, and then helping drive the appropriate downstream actions. Can you walk us through why that research phase matters and how it helps teams determine whether an issue requires remediation, escalation, or just more investigation?
When it comes to research for AI agentic and just kind of leveraging AI tools in a actual agent workflow versus a regular manual workflow, I mean, you can see very clearly the steps where I would have to be potentially spending hours looking at data across it, just even that research or that initial, it happened here, or even targeting where something might happen, right? Like, especially in GRC or kind of security response, sometimes you don't know what the issue might be or what that gap initially is. And that fact finding mission is more vital than it might be during an audit period where you're discussing things and things kind of take a little bit longer. So being able to target or pinpoint more quickly what an issue might be is really important. And it is something that across a messy tech stack, an agent can pull in to, again, give me that information to then provide the action of what are we doing? Is it a remediation? Is it an action right away? Or am I pulling the bell alarms and everyone's getting woken up with pager duty? So it kind of helps give that information to whether or not it requires an immediate, it requires a not, because there are a lot of false positives that you get from monitoring tools by and large. So being able to sift through the noise of your own organization, the noise of your own data, and then on top of it, the noise of those monitoring tools and what they might be reporting themselves. Like, I have no control over what other vendors choose to notify me of in the systems we buy. We just kind of try to fit it, right? And sometimes that doesn't fit. Sometimes part of the answer fits and it has to be built with other things to give you that full picture. So that's where the research component for agentic models specifically is very helpful for people in GRC who are trying to figure out what a gap is and what that true issue is. And sometimes it's as simple as someone forgot to configure something correctly, or it could be an entire process or server is down, and being able to delineate between that, important to do that faster rather than slower.
Thanks so much, Brittany. I think one thing really stands out from everything you shared. Agents aren't about replacing people or replacing workflows. They're about eliminating the manual research that slows GRC teams down so people can spend more time making decisions instead of gathering information. Let's make that a little more concrete with an example. Imagine a quarterly risk review that must be done by an analyst and reviewed by the GRC team. This is critical for staying proactive, identifying when controls are failing, for example, maybe a system security configuration changed at scale, or the goalpost moved because a new framework requirement was added. Maybe something drifted in a system where access to sensitive data is managed. You want to identify this before an auditor does and proactively manage the risk. And a quarterly visibility report can help with this. You don't necessarily need AI to identify that drift, although it can be helpful. A lot of GRC work is deterministic, it's binary. The rule either passes or fails. The configuration is either aligned or it's not. And where AI becomes powerful is correlating the context across various libraries, including your risk register, checking for related findings and controls, and everything that happens downstream, because that's where GRC teams lose time. Someone has to understand what changed in the risk posture. Someone has to check whether this has happened before. Someone has to see whether related controls are also failing, look for open findings and prior exceptions, compensating controls, ownership information, and of course, remediation history. And then someone has to turn all of that into a clear next step. That is where an agent can help. Instead of asking an analyst to spend hours collecting that information, the agent researches issues across your GRC environment. It connects the dots for robust risk reporting, identifies related risks, finds previous findings, checks for active exceptions, understands ownership, and drafts a recommendation for a remediation plan. And this is just one example of how an anecdotes agent can help enhance risk visibility for better decision making and free up your team's time for actually addressing risk. Again, the agent is not operating in a silo, but also with human engagement. So, for instance, to review this quarterly report, by the time an analyst gets involved, they're reviewing a complete picture instead of starting from scratch. The analyst can then route that issue to the right owner with the right context before the issue becomes a finding or an incident or another fire drill at audit time. And once that context has been assembled, the workflow doesn't disappear. It continues. The report is submitted, issues are routed to the right owners, remediation begins, approvals happen when they're needed, and people remain accountable for the final decision. That's the real power of AI in GRC. It doesn't replace judgment or accountability, and it doesn't turn compliance into a black box. It takes care of the work that doesn't require human judgment, so your experts can focus on the work that does. It's doing the legwork of correlating data, surfacing patterns, reducing manual searching and copy pasting, reconciliation, and follow up work that consumes so much of a GRC team's week. And most importantly, it's showing people where human action needs to happen. And that's really the evolution from workflows to agents. Workflows are still incredibly valuable. They provide structure, consistency, and governance. Agents make those workflows smarter by doing the research, gathering the context, and reducing the manual effort that has always slowed GRC teams down. But as Brittany pointed out, none of that works without the right foundation. Agents are only as good as the data they're built on. And if they're operating on disconnected spreadsheets and stale evidence and incomplete information, they'll simply automate bad decisions faster. But when they're grounded in structured, source-connected, audit-ready data, they become something incredibly valuable, a trusted partner that helps GRC teams move faster without sacrificing control. And that's the future we're building toward, not replacing GRC professionals, but giving them the context they need to focus on judgment instead of busy work. Thanks again, Brittany, for sharing your experience and perspective. Thank you all for joining us. Back to you, Meryl.